Thomas McAllister jolted awake at 3:47 a.m., his weathered hands gripping the bed sheets. Something ain't right when a dog knows more than his owner, he thought, watching Apollo pace the cabin's perimeter in perfect military formation. The German Shepherd moved like a ghost through moonlit shadows, stopping at exactly 47 positions around the house, each pause deliberate, each stance alert. Apollo's tags caught the silver light, revealing two different names etched in metal, one civilian, one military. Thomas had found Apollo 14 months ago, bleeding and broken on Highway 89. Tonight, watching his loyal companion perform this mysterious ritual, questions clawed at his chest like winter wind. What happened during those 8 missing months before the highway? What secrets lived behind those intelligent brown eyes? Apollo suddenly froze at the kitchen window, ears rigid as rifle barrels. A low growl rumbled from his throat, not quite dog, almost human. Outside, something moved in the Montana darkness. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The memory hit Thomas like a punch to the gut every time he drove past that stretch of Highway 89. 14 months ago, October 2022, he'd been making his weekly grocery run to Great Falls when the unexpected snowstorm rolled in fast and mean, the kind of weather that turns Montana roads into death traps without warning. He'd been thinking about Margaret that day, missing her voice humming in the passenger seat during their Sunday drives. 2 years since cancer took her, and the silence still felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. The windshield wipers fought against the heavy snow when his headlights caught something dark sprawled on the shoulder. Thomas pulled over, emergency flashers cutting through the white curtain. His paramedic training kicked in before his heart could process what he was seeing. A massive German Shepherd, unconscious and bleeding, lying motionless in the gathering snow. The dog's rich tan and black coat was matted with blood from multiple wounds, his powerful frame shuddering with each labored breath. "Easy there, boy," Thomas had whispered, kneeling in the slush. His experienced hands found a weak pulse, assessed the injuries. These weren't from a vehicle strike. Too precise, too calculated. Claw marks, maybe. But what kind of animal could do this to a dog this size? The shepherd's collar was military-style leather, thick and worn with partially torn tags that jingled softly in the wind. As Thomas carefully lifted the unconscious animal, something about the dog's positioning struck him as odd. Even injured, even barely alive, the shepherd had arranged himself facing downhill with clear sight lines in 3 directions, like he was standing guard even while dying. Thomas wrapped the dog in his emergency blanket, surprised by the animal's weight, easily 75 pounds of solid muscle. During the careful drive home, the shepherd never made a sound, but Thomas caught those dark eyes watching him in the rearview mirror. Intelligence burned behind the pain, along with something else. Wariness, like this dog had learned not to trust easily. At the cabin, Thomas set up a makeshift recovery area by the fireplace, cleaning wounds and applying bandages with the same gentle care he'd shown Margaret during her final months. The shepherd accepted the treatment without resistance, those remarkable eyes tracking every movement. "You're going to need a name," Thomas had said softly, scratching behind the dog's ears. "How about Apollo? You've got that noble look about you." At the sound of that name, the shepherd's tail had given the faintest wag. Just once. But it was enough to seal something between them, a bond that would soon prove deeper and more complicated than either of them could imagine. Thomas should have reported finding Apollo to the authorities. Should have checked for missing dog reports. Should have asked more questions. Instead, he'd chosen to keep the secret that was now keeping him awake at 3:47 a.m., watching his mysterious companion guard against invisible threats in the Montana darkness. The morning sun filtered through the cabin windows as Thomas loaded Apollo into his pickup truck for their routine visit to Dr. Sarah Henderson's veterinary clinic. Apollo had been acting stranger than usual lately. The midnight perimeter checks, the way he'd freeze at the sound of distant helicopters, how he'd position himself between Thomas and any stranger who approached too quickly. Something was eating at that dog, and Thomas figured a professional opinion might shed some light. Dr. Henderson had been the town's only veterinarian for 15 years, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who'd seen everything from calving complications to rattlesnake bites. She greeted Apollo with the easy confidence of someone who understood animals better than most people understood themselves. "How's our mysterious boy doing?" she asked, running practiced hands along Apollo's flanks. The dog stood perfectly still, alert but calm, those intelligent eyes tracking her every movement. "That's what I'm hoping you can tell me, Doc," Thomas replied, watching as she examined Apollo's ears and teeth. "He's been acting like he's expecting trouble that ain't coming." Dr. Henderson paused, her fingers finding something behind Apollo's left shoulder blade. "Thomas, has Apollo ever been microchipped?" "Not that I know of. Found him on the highway, remember? No paperwork, no previous owner information." She reached for her scanner, a small device that would detect any electronic identification chips. The machine beeped immediately, displaying a series of numbers and letters that made her eyebrows shoot up. "Well, I'll be damned. This isn't a standard pet chip, Thomas. These codes, they look military." Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Military? K947 AFG 2021. That's a Department of Defense identification system." Dr. Henderson's voice dropped to a whisper. "Thomas, this dog's been through hell and back. Look at these scars, surgical scars." "Professional work. And this chip? Apollo's a war dog." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a campfire that wouldn't die. Thomas stared at Apollo, who seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere. The dog's ears perked forward, and he moved closer to Thomas's side, pressing his massive body against the old man's legs in a gesture of protection. "Should I report this?" Dr. Henderson asked carefully. "The military might be looking for him." Thomas's jaw tightened. Sometimes the right thing and the legal thing ain't the same, he thought, remembering his father's words from decades past. "Doc, this dog's been with me over a year. He's healthy, he's happy, and he's got a good home. What they want with him now?" Before Dr. Henderson could answer, Apollo suddenly tensed, his body going rigid as steel. Through the clinic's front window, they could see the weekly flag ceremony beginning in the town square across the street. Every Tuesday at 10 o'clock, the VFW raised colors while a small crowd of locals gathered to pay their respects. Apollo's transformation was immediate and startling. Without any command from Thomas, the dog moved to face the window, sat at perfect attention, and remained motionless as the flag climbed the pole. His posture was military precise, chest out, head high, eyes fixed on the stars and stripes catching the morning breeze. "Jesus Christ," Dr. Henderson breathed. "Look at him." Thomas watched in amazement as Apollo maintained his position throughout the entire ceremony. When the small crowd began reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, Apollo's ears perked forward as if he were listening to familiar words. Only when the ceremony concluded did he relax, turning back to Thomas with what could only be described as a satisfied expression. They left the clinic in silence, Thomas's mind churning with questions. As they walked through the town square, he noticed how people reacted to Apollo. Mary Crenshaw, the town's unofficial news broadcaster, watched them with narrowed eyes from her post outside the general store. "That's no ordinary dog," she called out, loud enough for half the square to hear. "Military dogs are weapons, Thomas. You sure you know what you're dealing with?" Pastor Bob Williams, who'd been folding chairs after the flag ceremony, straightened up with a stern expression. "Mary, that dog's been nothing but a blessing to this community. I've seen him with the children gentle as a lamb." "Gentle until he's not," Mary shot back. "These war dogs, they're trained to kill. What happens when something triggers him?" Sheriff Dave Morrison approached the growing discussion, his weathered face showing the strain of a man caught between friendship and duty. "Thomas, we need to talk about this. If Apollo's military property—" "Property?" Thomas's voice carried the edge of a man who'd reached his limit. "Dave, this dog ain't property. He's family. You see property when you look at him?" As if summoned by the conversation, Apollo moved through the small crowd, his behavior a masterclass in controlled power. He approached each person differently, keeping respectful distance from Mary, offering his head for Pastor Williams to pat, sitting calmly beside Sheriff Morrison's leg. It was as if he were reading each human's comfort level and adjusting accordingly. "Look at him," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the square. "This is a dog who knows people. He's been trained, yes, but trained to protect, trained to serve. Every dog has his day, and this one's earned his retirement." The debate might have continued, but Apollo suddenly broke away from the group, padding purposefully toward the small cemetery at the edge of town square. Thomas followed, curious, as the dog led him down a neat row of headstones until he stopped at one particular grave. The marker was simple granite, weathered by Montana seasons. "Unknown soldier, Afghanistan 2021, freedom is not free." Apollo sat beside the grave with the same military precision he'd shown during the flag ceremony. He remained there for exactly 60 seconds, then looked up at Thomas with an expression that seemed to carry the weight of memories no dog should have to bear. "Sweet Jesus," Thomas whispered, pieces of a puzzle beginning to form in his mind. Afghanistan, 2021. The same year as Apollo's military identification code. That evening, as Thomas sat in his kitchen trying to make sense of the day's revelations, his phone rang. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number with a Colorado area code. "Mr. McAllister?" The voice was young, male, strained with emotion. "Sir, I heard through some channels that you might have found a German Shepherd. A military working dog. His name might be Apollo, but his real name is Phoenix. Is he okay?" Thomas gripped the phone tighter, watching Apollo's ears perk up at the sound of the caller's voice, even through the receiver. The dog was suddenly alert, tail beginning to wag with an intensity Thomas had never seen. "Who is this?" Thomas asked, though his heart already knew the answer would change everything. "Sergeant David Chen, sir. Phoenix is my dog, my partner. I've been looking for him for 14 months, and I think I'm about to lose my mind if I don't find him soon." Thomas hung up the phone with shaking hands, telling Sergeant Chen he'd call back in the morning. He needed time to think, time to sort through the storm of emotions threatening to tear him apart. Apollo, Phoenix, sat beside his chair, those intelligent brown eyes studying Thomas's face with an intensity that suggested the dog understood more than any animal should. "Phoenix," Thomas said softly, testing the name. Apollo's ears shot forward immediately, his whole body tensing with recognition. "That's your real name, isn't it, boy?" The walk along Blackfoot River Trail had always been Thomas's sanctuary, the place where he'd worked through his grief over Margaret's death, where he'd made peace with his son Michael's sacrifice in Iraq 19 years ago. Now, with Apollo padding silently beside him, Thomas found himself wrestling with a different kind of loss, the fear of losing someone he'd grown to love like family. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the distant promise of snow. Apollo moved with his usual silent grace, but today Thomas noticed things he'd missed before. The way the dog's head turned at precise angles, scanning for threats that existed only in military training. How he positioned himself to keep Thomas protected while maintaining clear sight lines in multiple directions. The calculated spacing he maintained from other hikers they encountered on the trail. "A man returns what ain't his," Thomas's conscience whispered, sounding suspiciously like his father's voice. The old man had been a straight shooter, never one to keep something that belonged to another. But then again, his father had never faced the prospect of losing the only companion that had made life worth living again. "Sometimes love means holding on," argued another voice in his head, this one softer, sounding like Margaret during one of their late-night conversations about difficult choices. She'd understood that life wasn't always black and white, that sometimes the heart knew truths that the law couldn't comprehend, but underneath both voices ran a current of fear that Thomas barely wanted to acknowledge. What if they take him away? What if this Sergeant Chen has more claim to Apollo's heart than I do? Thomas paused beside a fallen log, the same spot where he'd sat with Margaret during their last hike together. Apollo immediately moved into position, not quite sitting, but ready to spring into action if needed. The dog's alertness was constant, exhausting to watch. "You never really relax, do you, boy?" Thomas asked, scratching behind Apollo's ears. The contact seemed to calm the dog slightly, but his eyes continued scanning the forest around them. As they walked deeper into the wilderness, Thomas found himself studying Apollo's behavior with new understanding. The way the dog's ears rotated like radar dishes, picking up sounds Thomas couldn't hear. How he'd freeze momentarily at certain smells, his nose working the air with scientific precision. The subtle shifts in his body language that Thomas now realized were communication, warnings about approaching wildlife, alerts about weather changes, assessments of potential threats. "How many men did you save?" Thomas wondered, watching Apollo navigate a rocky section of trail with the fluid grace of a creature born for dangerous work. "How many times did you put yourself between death and some young soldier who just wanted to go home?" The thought led inevitably to darker questions. Apollo was a military working dog, trained for combat zones. That meant he'd been taught to find explosives, to detect enemies, to... Thomas's mind shied away from the full implications. He'd raised hunting dogs his whole life, knew the difference between a pet and a working animal. But this was something else entirely. Apollo wasn't just trained, he was weaponized. Can a weapon ever truly retire? The question haunted Thomas as they reached their usual turning point, a small clearing overlooking the valley. What if something triggers his training? What if he remembers he was made for war? But even as these fears circled his mind like vultures, Thomas watched Apollo's gentle interaction with a chipmunk that had ventured too close to their resting spot. The dog observed the small creature with interest but no aggression, his tail giving a small wag when the chipmunk chattered at him before scampering away. "A good dog is worth more than a fair-weather friend," Thomas reminded himself, another of his father's sayings. Apollo had been nothing but loyal, protective without being aggressive, intelligent without being manipulative. Whatever he'd been trained to do in Afghanistan, here in Montana he was simply a companion who'd brought purpose back to an old man's life. The forest around them was quiet except for the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Thomas found himself thinking about freedom, how that hawk could soar wherever it chose, while Apollo was bound by invisible chains of duty and ownership that stretched across continents and through bureaucratic systems that saw him as equipment rather than family. "Home is where the heart is, not where the paperwork says," Thomas said aloud, testing the words against the mountain air. Apollo's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and the dog moved closer, pressing his warm bulk against Thomas's legs in a gesture that had become familiar over their months together. The contact triggered a memory of Michael, how his son had called every Sunday during his deployment, always asking about the dogs first, before talking about his own situation. Michael had understood that connection between soldier and animal, had spoken reverently about the military working dogs he'd encountered overseas. "These dogs save lives every day," Michael had said during one of their last conversations. "They're not just animals, Dad. They're warriors with hearts bigger than most humans I know." Thomas's throat tightened at the memory. If Michael could see Apollo now, what would he say? Would he tell his father to do the legal thing, return the dog to military custody? Or would he understand that some bonds transcended ownership, that love earned through shared solitude and mutual comfort meant more than documents and chain of command? Apollo suddenly went rigid beside him, every muscle coiled for action. His gaze was fixed on a section of forest 30 yards away where Thomas could see nothing unusual. But the dog's body language spoke of absolute certainty. Something was wrong in that direction. Following Apollo's lead, Thomas moved carefully through the undergrowth until they reached what appeared to be a natural depression in the forest floor. Apollo began digging with methodical precision, his powerful paws revealing what looked like a deliberately concealed cache. Thomas's breath caught as Apollo uncovered a damaged military radio, medical supplies still in their waterproof packaging, and survival gear that showed signs of extended use. The equipment was arranged with military efficiency, each item placed for maximum accessibility in an emergency. "Sweet Jesus," Thomas whispered, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "This is where you lived. This is how you survived those 8 months." Apollo sat back on his haunches, watching Thomas examine the cache. The dog's expression seemed almost relieved, as if he'd been waiting for someone to discover this evidence of his wilderness ordeal. Here was proof of intelligence, resourcefulness, and survival instincts that went far beyond normal canine capabilities, but it also raised new questions. Why had Apollo remained in the wilderness for so long? Why hadn't he tried to return to civilization, to find his way back to military personnel who would have recognized his value? What had kept him hidden in these mountains, living like a wild animal when he was clearly trained to work with humans? The radio was damaged, but still partially functional. Thomas could see where Apollo had tried to operate it. Scratches around the controls that matched the dog's claws, evidence of desperate attempts at communication that never quite succeeded. "You tried to call for help," Thomas realized, his heart breaking for the loyal animal who'd spent months trying to rejoin his unit, his handler, his purpose. "You never gave up trying to go home." But then another thought struck him, darker and more troubling. If Apollo had been trying to return to military service, if he'd spent 8 months attempting to re-establish contact with his unit, what had changed? What had made him stop trying and accept rescue from a civilian stranger on a snowy highway? Thomas looked into Apollo's eyes, searching for answers in their brown depths. What he saw there was a complexity of emotion that took his breath away. Loyalty, intelligence, and something that looked almost like relief. As if Apollo had finally found what he'd been looking for, even though it wasn't what he'd originally sought. The truth hit Thomas like a physical blow. Apollo hadn't stopped trying to go home. He'd found a new home. Here, with a lonely old man who needed purpose as much as the dog needed peace. They'd rescued each other. But now Sergeant Chen's phone call threatened to shatter that fragile healing, to drag Apollo back into a world of duty and warfare that might destroy the gentle spirit Thomas had watched emerge over 14 months of patient care. Sometimes the strongest among us carry the heaviest burdens, Thomas thought, remembering Margaret's words about the veteran she'd volunteered to help at the VA hospital. Maybe Apollo's burden wasn't just surviving. Maybe it was learning to live with peace after a lifetime of war. As they headed back toward the cabin, Thomas made a decision that would have consequences he couldn't yet imagine. Tomorrow he would call Sergeant Chen back, but tonight he would hold on to this moment of perfect understanding between man and dog, this recognition that love sometimes meant making choices that looked wrong from the outside but felt absolutely right from within. Apollo seemed to sense the shift in Thomas's resolve. The dog's step became lighter, more confident, as if he understood that whatever came next, they would face it together. The phone call came at 7:30 the next evening, just as Thomas was settling into his worn leather chair with Apollo stretched out beside the fireplace. The caller ID still showed that Colorado number, and Thomas's chest tightened as he reached for the receiver. "Mr. McAllister, this is David Chen again. I know this must be confusing for you, sir." The young man's voice carried a tremor that spoke of sleepless nights and barely controlled desperation. Thomas could hear the weight of military training fighting against raw emotion, discipline warring with hope. "Son, before we go any further, I need to know something," Thomas said, watching Apollo's ears perk up at the sound of David's voice through the speaker. "Are you calling to take this dog back to active duty?" There was a long pause, filled with the kind of silence that revealed more than words ever could. When David finally spoke, his voice cracked like thin ice under pressure. "Sir, I'm not calling as a representative of the United States Army. I'm calling as someone who lost his best friend and hasn't been able to sleep right since it happened." Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the defensive knot he'd carried since yesterday's revelation. "What do you mean, son?" "Mr. McAllister, I need to tell you something that could get me court-martialed just for saying it out loud." David's breathing was audible through the phone, rapid and shallow. "Phoenix, Apollo, he's not just a military working dog to me. He's my battle buddy. He saved my life more times than I can count, and when we lost him in that helicopter crash, sir, I went AWOL to search for him." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Thomas understood immediately what this confession meant. In the military, going absent without leave was a serious offense. For a soldier to risk court-martial, prison time, and a dishonorable discharge meant David's attachment to Apollo went far deeper than professional obligation. "How long have you been AWOL, son?" 14 months, sir. Same amount of time Phoenix has been missing." David's voice broke completely. "I know where he is now because I've been monitoring police reports, veterinary databases, anything that might give me a lead. When Dr. Henderson scanned his chip yesterday, it triggered an alert in the system I've been using." Thomas looked at Apollo, who had risen to his feet and was now standing at attention, clearly recognizing David's voice, even through the phone. The dog's tail was wagging with an intensity Thomas had never seen, his whole body vibrating with excitement and confusion. "David, the military must be looking for both of you." "Yes, sir. They want Phoenix back because he was part of a classified program. And they want me back to face charges for desertion." David's laugh was bitter, hollow. "The thing is, Mr. McAllister, I don't care what happens to me anymore. I just need to know Phoenix is safe and happy. That's all that matters." Thomas felt his understanding of the situation shift like sand beneath his feet. This wasn't a case of the military demanding return of valuable property. This was a young man who'd sacrificed everything to find his lost companion, who'd thrown away his career and risked his freedom for love. "Son, you said he was part of a classified program. What kind of program?" Another pause, this one filled with the weight of military secrets and personal anguish. "Sir, Phoenix wasn't trained for regular patrol work. He was part of a special operations unit that worked with high-value targets. He's trained for counterterrorism, hostage rescue, and other things I can't talk about on an open line." The implications hit Thomas like a sledgehammer. Apollo wasn't just a war dog. He was an elite operative, trained for the most dangerous missions the military could devise. The gentle companion who brought Thomas his slippers each morning, who slept peacefully by the fireplace, was capable of lethal force in ways Thomas had never imagined. "David, I need you to understand something," Thomas said carefully. "This dog has been living with me for over a year. He's been gentle, protective, but never aggressive. Are you telling me he's dangerous?" "No, sir." David's response was immediate and fierce. Phoenix would never hurt an innocent person. His training was specific, targeted. He can distinguish between threats and civilians better than most humans. But, sir, the military sees him as a weapon, not a veteran. They don't have retirement programs for dogs like Phoenix. If they get him back. What happens if they get him back? The silence stretched so long Thomas thought the connection had been lost. When David finally spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute certainty. "They'll put him back in the field, sir, or they'll—" David's voice failed him entirely. "They'll what, son?" "They'll euthanize him. Phoenix has seen too much, knows too much. The military doesn't take chances with security risks, even four-legged ones." Thomas's blood ran cold. The idea of Apollo, loyal, gentle Apollo, being destroyed because he'd become inconvenient to bureaucrats who saw him as equipment rather than family, was beyond comprehension. "Sir, there's something else you need to know," David continued, his voice steadying with resolve. "Phoenix didn't just disappear in that helicopter crash. He saved everyone on board. The pilot, the crew chief, two other handlers, and their dogs. Phoenix pulled them from the wreckage one by one, then disappeared into the wilderness before the rescue teams arrived." Apollo seemed to sense the emotional weight of the conversation. The dog moved to Thomas's side, pressing his massive head against the old man's leg in a gesture of comfort. It was the same behavior Thomas had seen countless times, Apollo's instinctive response to distress, his need to provide comfort to anyone in pain. "Why didn't he stay with the rescue teams?" Thomas asked. "Because Phoenix was trained never to compromise the mission, never to reveal operational details to unauthorized personnel. When he saw civilian rescue workers instead of military handlers, he recognized his training kicked in. He protected himself and the classified information in his head by disappearing. The pieces of Apollo's mysterious past were falling into place like puzzle fragments, forming a picture Thomas wasn't sure he wanted to see completely. Apollo's 8 months in the wilderness hadn't been random survival. They'd been a classified operative maintaining operational security while trying to find a way home. "David, why are you telling me all this? Why risk everything to warn a stranger?" "Because you're not a stranger anymore, sir. You're Phoenix's family now. I can hear it in his reactions when I call. I can see it in the background check I ran on you." David caught himself, realizing he'd admitted to investigating Thomas. "Sir, I know about your son Michael. I know about your wife Margaret. I know you understand loss and service and what it means to love something more than your own safety." Thomas felt tears threatening for the first time since Margaret's funeral. This young soldier had risked court-martial not to reclaim Apollo, but to protect him. David's love for the dog was so pure, so selfless, that he was willing to sacrifice his own freedom to ensure Apollo's safety. "What do you want from me, son?" "I want you to keep him, sir. I want Phoenix to live the peaceful life he's earned. But I need you to know that they're coming for both of us. The military has been closing in on my location, and once they find me, they'll come for Phoenix too." Apollo was now fully alert, his body language suggesting he understood the gravity of the conversation, even without comprehending the words. His positioning had shifted subtly, no longer the relaxed companion by the fireplace, but the tactical operative ready for action. "How long do we have?" "Maybe days, maybe hours." "Sir, I'm not asking you to break the law or put yourself in danger, but if there's any way you can keep Phoenix safe until I can figure out a legal solution." "Son, you said Phoenix would never hurt an innocent person. What about people who aren't innocent? What about people who come to take him away?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications. Neither man wanted to voice directly. Thomas was asking whether Apollo would defend himself and his new family if threatened. David was being asked to reveal just how dangerous his former partner could become if cornered. "Mr. McAllister, Phoenix's loyalty is absolute. Once he's bonded with someone, he'll protect them with his life. But his judgment is perfect. He won't act unless there's a genuine threat. And if there is a genuine threat, then God help whoever threatens his family, sir, because Phoenix won't." Thomas looked into Apollo's eyes and saw something he'd missed before. Not just intelligence and loyalty, but the quiet confidence of a warrior who'd seen the worst humanity could offer and had never broken. Apollo was both the gentle companion who'd brought joy back to Thomas's life and the elite operative capable of deadly force. "David, there's something I need to ask you. If you could see Phoenix again, if you could say goodbye properly, would that be worth the risk of capture? Sir, just knowing he's safe and loved is enough for me." "I don't need—" "Son, that's not what I asked." The silence stretched between them, filled with longing and impossible choices. When David finally answered, his voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, sir. It would be worth everything." Thomas made a decision that would change all their lives. "Then you better get yourself to Montana, boy. We've got some talking to do." 3 days after Thomas's phone call with David, the military convoy rolled into Millfield like thunder before a storm. Thomas watched from his kitchen window as 5 black vehicles formed a perimeter around his property, their occupants moving with the precise efficiency of a well-rehearsed operation. Apollo stood beside him, every muscle coiled tight as a spring, his transformation from household pet to tactical operative complete and terrifying. The lead vehicle's door opened and a woman in military dress uniform stepped out. Colonel Patricia Hayes moved with the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience, her steel-gray hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her weathered face set in lines that suggested she'd seen too many difficult conversations. Behind her emerged Captain Mike Rodriguez, a younger officer whose by-the-book posture contrasted sharply with the nervous energy radiating from the third figure, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the military veterinarian whose kind eyes seemed at odds with her mission. Thomas opened his front door before they could knock, Apollo positioned slightly ahead of him in a protective stance that left no doubt about the dog's priorities. The sight of the German shepherd caused an immediate reaction among the military personnel. Hands moved instinctively toward sidearms, tactical positions shifted, and the entire dynamic of the encounter changed from bureaucratic to potentially dangerous. "Mr. McAllister," Colonel Hayes said, her voice carrying the weight of authority and barely controlled impatience. "I'm Colonel Patricia Hayes, United States Army. You're harboring military property that belongs to the Department of Defense." "Colonel," Thomas replied, his own voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "This dog ain't property. He's family." Apollo's low growl rumbled through the morning air, not quite aggressive, but unmistakably warning. The sound made Captain Rodriguez take a half-step backward, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. Dr. Walsh noticed the movement and placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Sir, that animal is trained to kill," Rodriguez said, his voice tight with tension. "He's been classified as a high-value asset with specialized capabilities that make him extremely dangerous to civilian populations." Thomas felt a cold anger building in his chest. "Son, you're standing on my property, calling my companion dangerous with your hand on your gun. Who exactly is the threat here?" The standoff might have escalated, but movement at the edge of the forest caught everyone's attention. David Chen emerged from the tree line, his hands visible and empty. his military bearing evident despite civilian clothes that hung loose on his thin frame. The young sergeant looked like he'd aged a decade in the 14 months since Apollo's disappearance. Hollow cheeks, haunted eyes, and the careful movements of someone carrying invisible wounds. Apollo's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. The dog's tactical alertness dissolved into pure joy as he recognized his former handler. His entire body trembled with excitement, but he remained in position beside Thomas, torn between his protective duty and his desperate desire to reunite with David. "Phoenix," David called softly, his voice breaking on the name. "Easy, boy. I'm here." Colonel Hayes whirled to face David, her expression shifting from annoyance to fury. "Sergeant Chen, you are under arrest for desertion, violation of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and theft of classified materials. Captain Rodriguez, place this man in custody immediately." But something extraordinary happened in that moment. As Rodriguez moved toward David, Apollo stepped forward, placing himself between the approaching officer and both men he loved. The dog's posture was unmistakably protective, his message clear: no one would harm either of his humans while he drew breath. "Stand down, Phoenix," David commanded, using his old authoritative tone. Apollo's ears flicked toward his former handler, but the dog didn't move. Instead, he looked back at Thomas, seeking guidance from his current alpha. The psychological complexity of the moment was staggering. Apollo was caught between competing loyalties, military training, warring with emotional bonds formed over months of civilian life. Thomas could see the conflict in the dog's eyes, the confusion of a creature being asked to choose between two different versions of love. "Easy, boy," Thomas said quietly, placing a gentle hand on Apollo's head. "Nobody's going to hurt anybody here, Doctor." Walsh stepped forward, her veterinarian's eye taking in Apollo's condition with professional assessment. "Colonel, this dog is in remarkable shape for an animal that's been missing for over a year. Mr. McAllister, you've clearly provided excellent care." "Ma'am, Apollo's been more than just well cared for," Thomas replied, grateful for her more reasonable tone. "He's been loved. He's been part of a family. He's been healing." "Healing from what?" Colonel Hayes snapped, her patience clearly exhausted. David answered before Thomas could respond. "From PTSD, ma'am. Phoenix has been suffering from canine post-traumatic stress disorder since our last mission in Afghanistan. The helicopter crash was just the final trauma in a series of events that broke something inside him. The admission hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled." Military working dogs with PTSD were a reality the armed forces preferred not to acknowledge publicly, and David had just forced the issue into the open with witnesses present. "That's classified information, Sergeant," Hayes warned. "With respect, ma'am, nothing about Phoenix's suffering should be classified," David shot back, his military discipline finally cracking under the weight of 14 months of guilt and desperation. "He's given everything to this country. He's saved 47 lives in documented actions. He's been wounded in service, decorated for valor, and when he finally breaks under the weight of what we've asked him to do, we classify his pain?" Thomas watched the exchange with growing understanding. This wasn't just about Apollo's ownership, it was about how the military treated its veterans, human and canine alike. David's defiance wasn't just about love for his partner. It was about justice for a warrior who'd given everything and received bureaucratic indifference in return. Apollo seemed to sense the rising tension. His protective posture intensified, and Thomas could see the tactical training reasserting itself. The dog's positioning allowed him to monitor all approaching threats while maintaining escape routes, behavior that would have been admirable in a combat zone but was terrifying in a civilian setting. "Mr. McAllister," Dr. Walsh said carefully, "may I examine Phoenix? I'm not here to take him away, but I need to assess his current mental state." Thomas looked down at Apollo, who was watching the veterinarian with wary intelligence. "Doc, I reckon that's up to him." Dr. Walsh approached slowly, her movements deliberately non-threatening. Apollo allowed her to come within arm's reach, then sat precisely, offering his head for examination. Her trained hands found old scars, assessed muscle tone, checked reflexes with the thoroughness of someone who genuinely cared about animal welfare. "Remarkable," she murmured, more to herself than the others. "His stress indicators are minimal. Muscle tension is normal for alert status, not hypervigilant. Mr. McAllister, whatever you've been doing, it's working." "I've been treating him like family instead of equipment," Thomas replied pointedly. The comment struck home. Dr. Walsh's examination revealed a dog in excellent physical condition, emotionally stable, and clearly bonded with his civilian caretaker. Her professional assessment was undermining the military's narrative that Apollo was dangerous and needed immediate retrieval. Meanwhile, the standoff continued to escalate as more townspeople arrived. Pastor Bob Williams had heard about the military presence and came to offer support. Sheriff Dave Morrison pulled up in his patrol car, clearly uncomfortable with federal authorities operating in his jurisdiction without coordination. Mary Crenshaw positioned herself where she could observe everything and spread the news accordingly. "Colonel," Pastor Williams said, approaching with the confidence of a man accustomed to mediating conflicts, "this community has watched Thomas and Apollo for over a year. That dog has been nothing but a blessing to our town." "Pastor, this is a matter of national security," Hayes replied curtly. "Ma'am, with respect, national security includes the security of our communities. Apollo has been part of this community's security for 14 months. The crowd was growing, and Thomas could see Colonel Hayes calculating the optics of forcibly removing a beloved community dog while townspeople watched. Military operations played differently when civilians were recording with cell phones and posting to social media in real time. David seized the moment to make his own appeal. "Colonel, Phoenix has served his country with distinction. He's earned retirement, earned the right to choose his own life. Look at him. He's not a weapon anymore. He's a family dog who happens to have military training." "A family dog who could kill half this crowd if something triggered his combat protocols," Captain Rodriguez interjected. Apollo's head snapped toward Rodriguez at the word "kill," his ears flattening slightly. The captain's tactical assessment was probably accurate, but voicing it in Apollo's presence was monumentally stupid. Thomas could feel the dog's energy shift, becoming more focused, more dangerous. "Captain," Thomas said quietly, "I'd appreciate if you'd keep your voice down and your opinions to yourself. Apollo understands more than you think, and you're making him nervous." The truth was, Apollo understood everything. Thomas could see it in the dog's eyes. Complete comprehension of the threat he represented, the choice he faced, and the consequences either decision would carry. Apollo was choosing in real time between his military programming and his civilian family, between duty and love, between the warrior he'd been trained to be and the companion he'd learned to become. Dr. Walsh completed her examination and stepped back, her professional assessment complete. "Colonel, this dog shows no signs of psychological instability. His bonding with Mr. McAllister appears to have provided therapeutic benefits that exceed anything our military veterinary programs could offer." The admission was a professional bombshell. A military veterinarian was essentially stating that civilian care had succeeded where military protocols had failed, that love had accomplished what duty could not. Colonel Hayes faced a decision that would define not just Apollo's future, but the military's entire approach to veteran care. Standing in Thomas McAllister's yard, surrounded by citizens who'd rallied to protect one old man and his dog, she was being asked to choose between policy and humanity, between institutional authority and individual compassion. Apollo continued to hold his protective position, ready to defend both his families against any threat, even if that threat came from the very institution he'd served so faithfully. The warrior was prepared to fight his former commanders to protect his new home, a tragic irony that nobody present could ignore. The standoff had reached its breaking point, and everyone present understood that the next word spoken would determine whether this encounter ended in reunion or tragedy. The tension shattered when Apollo suddenly broke from his protective stance, his head snapping toward the forest with an alertness that made everyone freeze. His ears were locked forward, his body coiled like a spring, and a low whine escaped his throat, not of fear but of recognition. Something was moving through the trees, something that had triggered responses in Apollo that transcended his current loyalties. "Movement in the tree line," Captain Rodriguez called out, his hand moving to his sidearm. "Could be additional personnel." But David Chen was already moving, his face pale with understanding. "No," he whispered, then louder. "No, they followed me here." Before anyone could ask what he meant, figures emerged from the forest. Not military personnel, but a family moving with the desperate caution of people who'd been running for too long. A man in his 30s carried a small child while a heavily pregnant woman struggled to keep pace beside him. Their clothes were worn, their faces gaunt with exhaustion, and their eyes held the haunted look of refugees who'd seen too much. Apollo's transformation was immediate and startling. The tactical operative dissolved, replaced by something Thomas had never seen before, a gentle protector moving toward the family with purpose that transcended training. The dog approached the man, who dropped to his knees at the sight of Apollo, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Sag," the man whispered in what Thomas recognized as Pashto, reaching out to touch Apollo's head with reverent hands. "My friend, you found us again." The pregnant woman swayed on her feet, and Apollo immediately positioned himself as a brace, supporting her weight with his strong frame. The child, a girl of perhaps 6 years old, buried her face in Apollo's fur, her small body shaking with relief. "Jesus Christ," David breathed, understanding flooding his features. "This is where you've been. This is who you've been protecting." Colonel Hayes was staring at the scene in bewilderment, her tactical assessment struggling to process this unexpected development. "Sergeant Chen, explain what's happening here." David's voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge as he responded. "Ma'am, this is Jamal Naziri and his family. Jamal was our interpreter in Afghanistan. He worked with Phoenix and me for 2 years before the evacuation." The pieces of Apollo's mysterious past were falling into place like a jigsaw puzzle of heroism and sacrifice. Thomas watched as the dog continued to support the pregnant woman, his behavior gentle but protective, clearly comfortable with this family in ways that suggested long familiarity. "During the helicopter crash," David continued, his voice strengthening as the full truth emerged, "Phoenix wasn't just surviving in the wilderness. He found this family. They were lost during a blizzard, trying to reach the refugee resettlement center in Great Falls. Phoenix has been keeping them alive for 8 months. Dr. Walsh stepped forward, her medical training taking precedence over military protocol as she assessed the pregnant woman's condition. "This woman needs immediate medical attention. How far along is she?" Jamal struggled with English that was heavily accented but clear. 9 months. Baby comes soon. Phoenix, he bring us food, keep us warm, protect from bears and wolves. He save my family, like he saved soldiers." The revelation hit everyone present like a physical blow. Apollo hadn't abandoned his post or lost his sense of duty. He'd expanded his definition of mission to include protecting civilians who needed his help. For 8 months, he'd been conducting a solo humanitarian operation, keeping a refugee family alive in harsh wilderness conditions. "Where have you been living?" Thomas asked gently, his heart breaking for what this family had endured. Jamal pointed toward the forest. "Old cabin, maybe from mining time. Roof broken, but Phoenix show us how to fix. He bring rabbits, fish from stream. When wife gets sick, he bring medicine plants. He teach us what is safe to eat." Apollo's intelligence was even more remarkable than Thomas had realized. The dog had not only kept the family fed and protected, but had somehow taught them wilderness survival skills, sharing knowledge that bridged species and cultural barriers. Pastor Williams stepped forward, his face glowing with wonder. "This is Elijah and the ravens. This is the Good Samaritan with 4 legs. My Lord, what we're witnessing here is nothing short of miraculous." But Colonel Hayes was struggling with implications that went far beyond religious metaphor. "Mr. Naziri, you were supposed to report to the resettlement center in Great Falls. Why didn't you seek help from authorities?" Fear flickered across Jamal's features, and he instinctively moved closer to Apollo. "In Afghanistan, soldiers promise safety for interpreters, promise visa, promise new life. Then Taliban find my brother, kill him for helping Americans. When we arrive in Montana, men with guns come to center, ask questions about interpreters. Phoenix scents danger. Lead us away before they find us." The implication was chilling. Jamal's family had fled not just Afghanistan, but potential threats within the American resettlement system itself. Apollo's protective instincts had recognized danger that human systems had missed or ignored. David's face was ashen with understanding. "Ma'am, there were threats against interpreters' families even after evacuation. Some of them disappeared from resettlement centers. Phoenix's training would have detected hostile surveillance." Dr. Walsh was now examining the pregnant woman with growing concern. "She's in active labor. We need to get her to a hospital immediately." But Jamal shook his head frantically. "No hospitals, no government buildings. They find us, they send us back or make us disappear. Phoenix know this. Phoenix keep us safe." Apollo seemed to understand the conversation, his positioning shifting to keep the family grouped together while maintaining clear sight lines to all potential threats. His tactical awareness was operating at full capacity, but his gentle support of the laboring woman showed a compassion that transcended military training. Mary Crenshaw, who had been watching the proceedings with increasing amazement, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "That dog's been feeding this family, protecting them. Sweet Lord, what have we been calling him dangerous for?" Sheriff Morrison was already on his radio, calling for an ambulance and coordinating with social services. But his approach was careful, diplomatic, clearly understanding that this family's trust had been earned through months of Apollo's protection and wouldn't be easily transferred to human authorities. Thomas found himself looking at Apollo with entirely new understanding. This wasn't just a military working dog or even a beloved pet. This was a creature whose moral compass operated at a level that shamed most humans. Apollo had chosen to protect the vulnerable over following orders, to show mercy over maintaining protocol. "David," Thomas said quietly, "when you were searching for Apollo, did you know about this family?" David shook his head, his own amazement evident. "No, sir. I knew Jamal's family had gone missing from the resettlement system, but I assumed they'd been relocated for security reasons. I never imagined Phoenix had found them, never thought he'd expand his protective mission to include civilians." Colonel Hayes was facing a situation that no military manual had prepared her for. Her dangerous weapon had spent 8 months conducting an unauthorized humanitarian mission, keeping civilians alive through a Montana winter, protecting them from both natural dangers and human threats that official systems had failed to address. The pregnant woman, Layla, was clearly in distress now, her contractions coming faster. Apollo seemed to sense the urgency, his whines becoming more insistent as he looked between the family and the assembled humans, clearly expecting someone to take action. Dr. Walsh made the decision that would define the next phase of this extraordinary situation. "Colonel, I'm invoking medical emergency protocols. This woman needs immediate hospital care, and this family needs protection." Whatever our policy issues with Phoenix, they're secondary to saving lives. Pastor Williams was already organizing community response. Mary, call Dr. Patterson at the hospital. Tell him we're bringing in a refugee family. Sheriff, we'll need security, but low-key. These folks have reason to be scared. Thomas, can Apollo help us transport them? Apollo seemed to understand exactly what was needed. He positioned himself to help support Layla while she walked, his training in battlefield medical evacuation adapting seamlessly to civilian emergency response. The dog's calm presence appeared to be the only thing keeping Jamal's panic under control. As they prepared to move the family toward medical care, Thomas realized that Apollo's story had evolved far beyond a simple tale of military dog and civilian owner. This was a story about the nature of duty itself, about how true service transcends institutional boundaries and embraces a higher calling to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Colonel Hayes watched Apollo coordinate the family's movement with the efficiency of a trained professional, and Thomas could see her military assessment struggling with the reality before her eyes. This dangerous weapon was demonstrating levels of moral reasoning and compassionate action that challenged every assumption about military working dogs. "Sergeant Chen," she said finally, her voice carrying new uncertainty, "in your professional assessment, is Phoenix's behavior consistent with his military training?" David's answer came without hesitation. "Ma'am, Phoenix is performing exactly as he was trained, to protect those who cannot protect themselves, to serve a mission larger than himself, and to never abandon those under his care. He's been the perfect soldier." We just never understood how perfectly. Apollo continued his gentle support of the laboring woman, his massive frame providing stability and comfort as they prepared for the journey to town. But his eyes remained alert, scanning for threats, ready to defend his extended family against any danger that might emerge. The impossible had become inevitable. A military working dog had rewritten the rules of engagement, transforming a classified operation into a humanitarian mission, turning potential enemies into protected family, and challenging everyone present to expand their understanding of what it meant to serve with honor. As they began the careful procession toward medical care and safety, Thomas understood that Apollo had been teaching them all along. The dog's greatest mission wasn't the 47 lives he'd saved in Afghanistan, it was the lesson he was teaching about the true meaning of unconditional service, protection, and love. The convoy of military vehicles that had arrived to retrieve a dangerous weapon was now being led by that same weapon as he guided a refugee family toward safety, protected by the very community that had once questioned his presence among them. The birth of baby Sarah Naziri at Millfield General Hospital became the catalyst that transformed everything. As Layla labored through the night, Apollo maintained his vigil in the hospital waiting room, his presence somehow calming everyone present despite the sterile environment that should have triggered his trauma responses. Thomas sat beside the dog, watching military personnel, townspeople, and refugees unite around the miracle of new life. Dr. Jennifer Walsh had stationed herself as liaison between the military and civilian medical staff, her veterinary training proving surprisingly useful as she helped coordinate care for both mother and the stress-related health issues that 8 months of wilderness survival had created for the entire family. When baby Sarah finally arrived at 3:47 a.m., the same time Apollo had awakened Thomas with his mysterious vigil just days before, the symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. "She's healthy, Doctor," Patterson announced to the waiting room, his tired smile encompassing the unlikely assembly of people who'd become invested in this family's welfare. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, and strong as her mother. Apollo's tail wagged once, a single powerful sweep that somehow conveyed more joy than words could express. David Chen, who'd been granted temporary custody pending his military hearing, reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, and Thomas felt something shift in the complex dynamic between them. "He knows," David said quietly, wonder in his voice. "He knows the baby's safe." Colonel Hayes had spent the night making phone calls that would reshape her understanding of military working dog protocols. The story emerging from witness statements, medical records, and David's detailed debriefing painted Apollo not as a rogue operative, but as a soldier who'd expanded his mission parameters to protect civilians in life-threatening situations. "The Pentagon wants a full report," she told Dr. Walsh as dawn broke over the Montana mountains. "This case is being elevated to the Secretary of Defense level. We've never encountered a situation where a military working dog has conducted an extended humanitarian operation independent of human command." But the real transformation was happening in the conversations between Thomas, David, and Jamal as they shared coffee in the hospital cafeteria, while Apollo dozed at their feet. Three men from different generations and cultures, united by their connection to a dog whose moral compass had guided them all toward a larger understanding of family and duty. "In Afghanistan," Jamal explained, his English improving as his comfort level increased, "Phoenix saved my village 3 times. Find bombs before children step on them. But I think maybe Phoenix save us because he remember kindness. When other soldiers angry that dogs get better food than people, I share my rice with Phoenix." Small thing, but he remember. Thomas nodded, understanding how small acts of kindness could create bonds that transcended species and circumstances. "Apollo's got a memory for people who treat him right, but what he's done for your family goes way beyond returning a favor." David's guilt was evident in every word as he struggled to comprehend his partner's actions. "For 14 months, I thought I'd failed him. I thought he was lost, maybe dead, and it was my fault for not protecting him better during the crash. All this time, he was protecting people who needed him more than I did." "Son," Thomas said gently, recognizing the self-recrimination that could destroy a young man if left unchecked, "Apollo didn't leave you. He expanded his mission to include people who couldn't protect themselves. That's not abandonment, that's evolution." The hospital's social services coordinator, Janet Morrison, Sheriff Morrison's wife, had been working through the night to address the complex legal situation surrounding Jamal's family. Their refugee status was legitimate, but their disappearance from the resettlement system had triggered investigations that could complicate their asylum process. "The good news," she explained to the assembled group, "is that Apollo's protection of your family actually strengthens your asylum case. His behavior provides documented evidence that you faced legitimate threats that official systems failed to address." Pastor Williams had arrived with breakfast for everyone, his church already mobilizing to provide long-term support for the Naziri family. "We've got the old Hendricks place ready for occupancy," he announced. 3 bedrooms, fully furnished, and Apollo's already familiar with the property from his patrols. The mention of continuing Apollo's protective role raised the question that everyone had been avoiding. What would happen to the dog now that his humanitarian mission had been discovered? Colonel Hayes addressed the issue directly, her military bearing softened by the night's revelations. "The Department of Defense has 3 options," she explained. "Return Phoenix to active duty, which, given his specialized training and security clearances, would likely mean classified operations. Retire him to military care, which would mean confinement to a secure facility for the remainder of his life. Or," she paused, clearly struggling with the unprecedented 3rd option, "or recognize his exceptional service and grant him civilian retirement with full military honors," Dr. Walsh finished, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been making her own phone calls through the night. David's head snapped up. "That's possible?" "It's never been done before," Colonel Hayes admitted. "But Phoenix's case is unprecedented. The Secretary of Defense is considering creating new protocols for military working dogs who demonstrate exceptional humanitarian service beyond their original parameters." Thomas felt hope building in his chest, but also apprehension. What would civilian retirement mean for Apollo? It would mean he's officially recognized as a veteran rather than equipment, Dr. Walsh explained. He'd retain his military rank and honors, but he'd be free to choose his living situation. Most importantly, he'd have full veterans benefits, including medical care and protection under federal law. Apollo stirred at their feet, his head rising as if he sensed the importance of the conversation. His eyes moved between the three men who'd shaped his life: Thomas, who'd given him a home; David, who'd been his partner in service; and Jamal, whose family had given his protective instincts new purpose. "There's one more consideration," Colonel Hayes continued, her voice taking on the careful tone of someone presenting a complex proposal. "The Pentagon is interested in Phoenix's methods. His ability to conduct solo humanitarian operations, to bridge cultural barriers, to provide medical and survival assistance to civilians, these are capabilities they want to study and potentially replicate in future training programs." David's protective instincts flared immediately. "Ma'am, Phoenix isn't a test subject. He's a veteran who's earned his peace." "I'm not suggesting experimentation, Sergeant. I'm suggesting that Phoenix could become an instructor, teaching other military working dogs and their handlers about expanded mission parameters. It would be part-time work, completely voluntary, with full respect for his veteran status." The proposal was intriguing but complex. Apollo could retain his military connections while enjoying civilian life, contributing to training programs that might save more lives while never again facing combat situations that had traumatized him. Jamal spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of a man who understood debt and honor. "Phoenix choose his own life now. But if teaching help other dogs save families like mine, maybe Phoenix want to help. He good teacher. Show us many things in forest." Thomas looked down at Apollo, whose intelligent eyes seemed to be following the conversation with remarkable comprehension. The dog had spent 14 months proving that he could make complex decisions about duty, loyalty, and protection. Perhaps he'd earned the right to make this decision too. "How would we know what Apollo wants?" Thomas asked. Dr. Walsh smiled, the first genuine smile Thomas had seen from her since this ordeal began. "We ask him, not with words, but with choices. Present him with options, and let his behavior guide us." The testing was simple, but profound. They brought Apollo to 3 different locations: the military transport vehicles where he could rejoin active service, the Naziri family's new home where he could continue his protective mission, and Thomas's cabin where he'd found peace and purpose as a civilian companion. At each location, Apollo was given time to explore, to remember, to feel the emotional resonance of each choice. His behavior was carefully observed by military behaviorists, veterinary specialists, and the 3 men whose lives he'd transformed. At the military vehicles, Apollo approached with professional respect but no enthusiasm. He performed basic commands flawlessly, demonstrating that his training remained intact, but his body language suggested duty rather than desire. At the Naziri home, Apollo's protective instincts activated immediately. He checked perimeters, verified security, and positioned himself where he could monitor the baby's room. But his alertness was tinged with tension, the hypervigilance of a warrior who couldn't fully relax. At Thomas's cabin, Apollo's transformation was remarkable. His shoulders dropped, his breathing deepened, and for the first time in days, he truly relaxed. He brought Thomas his slippers, checked his familiar patrol routes, and settled by the fireplace with the contentment of a dog who'd found his place in the world. But the most telling moment came when they brought all 3 families together at the cabin. Apollo's solution was elegant in its simplicity. He created a new patrol route that encompassed all three properties, establishing himself as protector of an extended family that included his military handler, his civilian father, and the refugee family whose survival had given his service new meaning. Colonel Hayes watched Apollo's behavioral choices with growing amazement. "He's creating his own retirement plan," she observed. "Part-time protection for the Naziri family, part-time training assistance for military programs, and primary residence with Mr. McAllister." The unprecedented solution satisfied everyone's needs while honoring Apollo's autonomy. David would remain in Montana, working with Apollo on new training protocols while rebuilding his own life. Jamal's family would have continued protection while integrating into their new community. Thomas would keep his beloved companion while sharing him with those who also needed Apollo's unique gifts. As the sun set over the Montana mountains, casting golden light through the cabin windows, Thomas watched Apollo settle into his familiar spot by the fireplace. But now the dog's peaceful rest was deeper, more complete, because he'd finally found a way to honor all his loyalties without abandoning any of them. "You know what this means, don't you, boy?" Thomas said softly, scratching behind Apollo's ears. "You've just rewritten the book on what it means to serve." Apollo's tail wagged once, a gesture of satisfaction that suggested he understood exactly what he'd accomplished. He'd transformed from weapon to warrior to protector to teacher, proving that true service wasn't about following orders, but about following one's moral compass toward the highest good. The fragments of truth had finally assembled into a complete picture. Apollo wasn't just a military working dog who'd found civilian life, or a pet who'd revealed military training. He was something entirely new, a bridge between worlds, a teacher whose lessons transcended species, and a living example of how love could expand to encompass everyone who needed protection and care. 6 months later, Thomas McAllister stood on his porch watching the most remarkable sight he'd ever witnessed in his 73 years of life. In the meadow behind his expanded property, Apollo was conducting what could only be described as a masterclass in interspecies communication and tactical awareness. 3 young military working dogs sat at perfect attention while Apollo demonstrated patrol techniques. But what made the scene extraordinary was his audience of children, Zara Naziri and 6 other youngsters from town, all learning patience, observation, and gentle leadership from a decorated war veteran who happened to have 4 legs. The transformation of Millfield had been nothing short of miraculous. What had started as a controversial confrontation between federal authorities and a stubborn old man had evolved into a model program that was attracting attention from military installations, refugee resettlement organizations, and veterinary colleges across the country. The small Montana town had become an unlikely laboratory for proving that healing, service, and community could transcend every boundary humans had created. "Easy does it, Apollo," called out Sergeant Maria Santos, one of 3 military dog handlers who'd volunteered for the pilot program that Apollo now anchored. "Let Thunder get used to the civilian environment before you show him the advanced stuff." Apollo's teaching methods were unlike anything the military had ever documented. He would demonstrate a behavior, then wait patiently while the younger dogs attempted to replicate it. When they struggled, he'd break the action down into smaller components, showing remarkable understanding of how learning progressed. Most remarkably, he'd learned to modulate his instruction based on each dog's temperament and capability, proving that his intelligence operated on levels that challenged every assumption about canine cognition. Thomas felt a familiar surge of pride as he watched Apollo work. The dog had gained weight since those early days, his coat now glossy with health and contentment. But the changes went deeper than physical appearance. Apollo had found something that had eluded him throughout his military service: the perfect balance between purpose and peace, between duty and joy. David Chen emerged from the renovated barn that now served as the Millfield Canine Integration Center, carrying a clipboard thick with documentation from the morning's training session. At 29, David had aged into his responsibilities, the haunted look in his eyes replaced by the confident bearing of someone who'd found his calling. His military hearing had resulted in an honorable discharge with full benefits, and his new role as Apollo's civilian handler and program coordinator had given him purpose that transcended his PTSD. "How's our star pupil doing today?" Thomas asked, gesturing toward the meadow where Apollo was now demonstrating how to approach nervous children without triggering fear responses. "Better than the textbook said was possible," David replied, his voice filled with wonder that hadn't diminished despite months of witnessing Apollo's remarkable capabilities. "The Pentagon observers left yesterday, and they're recommending that the program be expanded to 5 additional sites. Apollo's teaching methods are revolutionary. He's showing us that military working dogs can be retrained for civilian integration without losing their tactical capabilities." The success of the program had created opportunities none of them had anticipated. Dr. Jennifer Walsh had transferred to civilian practice and now ran the veterinary component of the center, developing protocols for treating PTSD in military working dogs. Her research was being published in veterinary journals and had attracted funding from the Department of Veterans Affairs for expanded studies. Pastor Bob Williams approached from the direction of the new community center, his face glowing with the satisfaction of a man whose faith had been vindicated by miraculous events. "Thomas, the camera crew from 60 Minutes wants to interview you again tomorrow. They're particularly interested in Apollo's work with the refugee families." The media attention had been overwhelming initially, but Thomas had learned to manage it with the same steady patience Apollo brought to his teaching. The story of a war dog who'd become a bridge between military and civilian worlds, between American and Afghan cultures, between trauma and healing, had captured imaginations far beyond Millfield. But Thomas was careful to ensure that the attention served the mission rather than exploiting it. "Long as they don't interfere with Apollo's work or upset the families," Thomas replied, watching as Layla Naziri approached the training area with baby Sarah in her arms. Apollo's immediate shift in behavior, from instructor to gentle protector, never failed to amaze observers. Jamal had become an integral part of the program, serving as cultural interpreter and liaison for other refugee families who'd been referred to Millfield for integration services. His fluency in Pashto, Dari, and increasingly confident English made him invaluable for families struggling with the transition to American life. But his most important contribution was his testimony about Apollo's character and capabilities. "Phoenix save more than lives," Jamal had told the Pentagon evaluation team during their visit. "He save hope. He show that American promises can be true, that protection can come from unexpected places, that kindness has no language barriers." The ripple effects of Apollo's story had reached far beyond Montana. Military bases were requesting consultation on retirement programs for veteran working dogs. Refugee resettlement agencies were exploring animal-assisted therapy programs. Universities were studying the implications of Apollo's decision-making capabilities for understanding animal consciousness and moral reasoning. But for Thomas, the most meaningful changes were the quietest ones. Apollo's nightmares had stopped entirely. The dog slept through the night now, his breathing deep and even, no longer patrolling for threats that existed only in traumatic memories. His famous perimeter checks had evolved into leisurely walks that included stops to greet neighbors, inspect the garden, and check on the chickens that Layla had convinced Thomas to raise. Sheriff Dave Morrison pulled up in his patrol car, waving from the driver's seat. His wife Janet had become the program's coordinator for family services, helping integrate not just refugee families, but also military families dealing with their own transitions. The Morrison family's guest house now hosted visiting researchers, military observers, and journalists who came to document the Millfield miracle. "Thomas," Sheriff Morrison called out, "got a call from Fort Carson. They've got 3 handlers retiring next month, and they want to know if Apollo would be willing to help their dogs transition to civilian life." The requests came weekly now. Military installations, veteran services organizations, and civilian agencies all seeking Apollo's unique expertise. But David and Thomas had established clear protocols. Apollo worked 3 days a week with military dogs and their handlers, 2 days with refugee families and community programs, and kept weekends for rest and personal time. The schedule honored his veteran status while allowing him to share his extraordinary gifts. Mary Crenshaw approached with her characteristic energy, though her attitude toward Apollo had undergone a complete transformation. She'd become the program's most enthusiastic, unofficial publicist, organizing community events and managing the constant stream of visitors who wanted to meet the famous dog. "Thomas, Channel 8 wants to do a follow-up story about Apollo's impact on the children's program," she announced. "Little Zara's teaching the other kids Pashto words, and they're all learning patience and observation skills that their teachers say are remarkable." The children's component of the program had been an unexpected blessing. Apollo's gentle demeanor with youngsters had led to development of educational programs that taught empathy, cross-cultural understanding, and emotional regulation. Children who'd struggled with attention issues found focus when working with Apollo. Kids from different cultural backgrounds found common ground in their shared fascination with the remarkable dog. As evening approached, the day's activities wound down with familiar rhythm. The visiting military dogs returned to their temporary quarters in the renovated barn. Zara helped her mother prepare dinner, while baby Sarah napped in the portable crib Apollo insisted on inspecting regularly. David completed his documentation while planning the next day's activities. Thomas settled into his favorite chair on the porch, Apollo assuming his customary position beside him. The Montana sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. "You know what you've done, don't you, boy?" Thomas said softly, his weathered hand resting on Apollo's broad head. "You've shown us all that families come in all shapes and sizes, that service means different things to different folks, and that love is the only force strong enough to heal what war breaks apart." Apollo's tail wagged slowly, rhythmically, the movement of a dog completely at peace with his place in the world. He'd found a way to honor his military service while embracing civilian life, to protect those who needed protection while building rather than destroying, to teach rather than wage war. Dr. Walsh emerged from the barn, completing her evening rounds with the visiting dogs. Her research on Apollo's methods was revolutionizing military working dog programs, proving that these remarkable animals could transition successfully to civilian life while retaining their capabilities for protective service. Her work was giving hope to hundreds of military working dogs who might otherwise face euthanasia at the end of their service. As stars emerged in the Montana sky, Thomas thought about all the lives Apollo had touched, the soldiers he'd protected in Afghanistan, the refugee family he'd kept alive through a harsh winter, the military dogs he now taught, the children who learned gentleness from his example, and the old man who'd found purpose again through caring for a wounded warrior. "Not all heroes wear uniforms," Thomas murmured, remembering Pastor William's words from that first chaotic day. "Some wear fur, and some teach us that the greatest battles are won not with weapons, but with love." Apollo settled deeper into his favorite spot, his breathing steady and peaceful. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, new opportunities to bridge the gaps between worlds that humans insisted on keeping separate. But tonight he was simply a dog who'd found his perfect pack, a mix of civilians and soldiers, Americans and refugees, young and old, all united by the simple truth that family wasn't about blood or nationality or species, but about choosing to care for each other through whatever storms might come. The Millfield program had grown beyond anyone's wildest expectations, but its success was measured not in headlines or funding, but in the quiet moments like this one, when healing was complete, when peace was possible, and when love had proven once again that it was the most powerful force in any universe that mattered. Thomas closed his eyes and listened to the gentle sounds of his extended family settling in for the night. Apollo's soft breathing, baby Sarah's contented sighs from the nearby house, the distant laughter of David and Jamal planning tomorrow's training session, the rustle of evening wind through pine trees that had witnessed miracles. Sometimes what looks like an ending is really just a new beginning, Thomas thought, remembering his father's old saying. Apollo had taught them all that truth, that every sunset promised another sunrise, that every loss contained the seeds of unexpected love, and that every ending was simply another chance to choose hope over fear, unity over division, and family over everything else that didn't really matter in the end. In the gathering darkness, Apollo's steady presence was a reminder that some bonds transcended understanding, that some love was truly unconditional, and that some stories ended not with tragedy, but with the quiet triumph of ordinary miracles sustained by extraordinary hearts. Dear friends, after sharing Apollo's incredible journey with you, I want you to know that this story isn't just about a remarkable dog. It's about the truth we all carry in our hearts as we navigate these golden years of our lives. Like Thomas McAllister, many of us have faced the profound loneliness that comes after losing a spouse, after children move away, after retirement leaves us wondering if our best days are behind us. But Apollo's story reminds us that our greatest chapters might still be waiting to be written. At 67, Thomas thought his purpose had ended with Margaret's passing. Instead, he discovered that love multiplies when we open our hearts to unexpected family, whether that's a rescued animal, a neighbor in need, or even strangers who become chosen family. Apollo showed us that it's never too late to make a difference, that wisdom earned through life's battles can become our greatest gift to others, and that sometimes the very act of caring for someone else heals our own wounded hearts. Your experience, your kindness, your capacity to love, these aren't diminishing with age, they're deepening into something more precious than gold. What unexpected blessing has entered your life when you thought your story was ending? How has caring for others helped heal your own heart? Please share your stories below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.